My guest today in the Science Studio, which is here at the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, is James D. Watson, former director and now Chancellor of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. He was the first director of the National Center for Human Genome Research from 1989 to 1992, and he was the winner of the Nobel Prize in 1962 in Physiology or Medicine with Francis Crick and Maurice Wilkins for discovering the structure of DNA, an adventure that he described in his book, The Double Helix, of which I believe there are now over 1 million copies in print. So he's here to discuss his latest book, Avoid Boring People, Lessons from a Life in Science. The first lesson at the end of chapter 4 is use first names as soon as possible. So, Jim, let's start.
Francis was never Mr. Crick to me, or
Right.
Crick. He was Francis.
But let's start with the book's title. Roger has already actually alluded to this, but when I last saw you a few months at Cold Spring Harbor, you were very worried about the book's title because it originally said on here, Avoid Boring People. And you said to me that could be taken 2 ways, as an adjective or as a verb. Avoid boring people,
Yeah.
or avoid boring people.
Yeah.
So you have now got this title in here which says Avoid Boring Other People.
Well, that's the hidden title, but over Amazon, it's Avoid Boring People.
So is this some attempt to...
There's some attempt at humor and to indicate the double meaning, which escapes almost everyone.
Okay.
Because most people are trying to avoid other boring people.
Okay. Do you find in a life which will be 80 years long next year that you've had to run into a lot of boring people?
Well, when I was young. And it's been more my choice, as I'm older. I still have to meet a lot of boring people.
Yeah. There was... the book, it says here, contains, and I quote, my advice in the form of recollections of manners I deployed to navigate the worlds of science and of academia. So what do you mean by manners?
Rules or ways of behavior. Just
Strategies?
Strategies, yes. Getting into the university, or getting into graduate school, or getting a job at Harvard, or writing a book,
Okay.
or receiving a Nobel Prize.
It's, I see there's certainly a hint here where you have expect to put on weight after Stockholm. I would have thought that had fairly limited application. I mean, Roger certainly has one. I'm probably worried about that, and Renato Del Becco, but not many of us have to worry about that.
I mean, they offer you money on a lot of boring occasions after a Nobel Prize, and on boring occasions you eat.
Okay. Each chapter concludes with remembered lessons, as you describe them, rules of conduct that in retrospect figured decisively in turning my childhood dreams into reality. So what were the childhood dreams?
I wanted to be an important scientist.
And you think you've succeeded?
Yes.
So where did the influences come from? Why did you want to be an important scientist? Who were your parents?
My parents, my father was an unsuccessful businessman. My mother, I guess in the old days we had said, was a homemaker. But really because of the Depression, we needed the money, and she began to work even though she had a very weakened heart. So she enjoyed her work, so it wasn't a tragedy. She had a job because her mother lived with us and was there when we came home from school. My Irish grandmother. Right.
So your heritage originally is sort of Scottish-Irish?
Well, hopefully, 100% the, England and Ireland. But, I just hope I have no German blood. I'm a product of the Second World War. I mean, you got to realize who the allies were, you know.
So you're a great you approve of the European Common Market, do you then? You like international cooperation in
Yeah,
Europe?
I like international cooperation, but I generally don't like universal rules because cultures are so different. It's very hard to get rules to apply across cultures.
Right. You as a child, there was any science in your family?
An uncle of mine was my father's brother was a professor of physics at Yale.
Which is significant.
He was never really a role model because I think in American Men of Science he listed that he was a Republican and an Episcopalian. So, you know, that's put me off.
My memory is that you described your father as irreligious.
Yes.
And your mother was
my mother had
democratic.
She was not an Irish Catholic. She was an Irish Democrat.
Right.
I mean, nominally she was Catholic, but I mean her emotions didn't go for God, but for the Democratic Party. I mean, that was the thing that counted in her life.
Right. The years here, you were born in 1928, right?
Yes. So in 1933, I would have been 5. I remember going with my mother, driving down to the LaSalle Bank. There was a bank run for money. There, you know, what happened in Northern Rock in England 2 weeks
people
ago.
were trying to get withdrawals out.
Withdraw their money. They didn't trust the banks.
So that was in 1930.
And then the car disappeared, and so I never, you know, very easily saw the center of Chicago. It was an hour away by streetcar. The University of Chicago was only 25 minutes away, so that was a practical place to go.
Okay, so straitened circumstances, but you nevertheless had good schooling.
Yeah, very good schooling. And, but I was very lucky. I, missed the last 2 years of high school to go at 15 to the University of Chicago because, in Chicago they would all been asking the question, what? And what happened? And at Chicago it was why it happened.
But they had a rather unusual president at Chicago.
Yes. I mean, he was the only
Robert
college
Hutchins.
president whose name has been ever remembered because he pointed out the trade school aspects of many American universities, that you weren't there to think, you were there to get a trade degree. And he had an abhorrence of sports, which was deplorable. So he let Chicago get out of the Big Ten, which, for many people was the end of the university.
Now, are you saying you think the sports are important, or...?
I saw Chicago's last Big Ten basketball game. And it was during the war, and for 3 quarters we stayed even with Ohio State because of some naval people who were on campus. And then it was all over. And then Chicago was playing schools like Wheaton, Grinnell. Very, very humiliating.
But so you went to Chicago at 15, and then from there to the University of Indiana, right?
Yeah, Chicago was, I finally realized, for at least 30 years afterwards, I never gave Chicago a cent. There was no affection felt toward it, the university. But then I saw its essence when it was listed in the U.S. News and Report as the 3rd most unpleasant place to get a college education in the United States. And that really, number 5 was Johns Hopkins, number 4 was Rensselaer Polytech, number 2 was the military academy, and the Naval Academy was the most unpleasant, or vice versa. And so I saw that what Chicago was officers training school for intellectuals. It really knocked you down. It wanted to make you an officer, and I think that's what Chicago did. And so You were made to think. You just could not avoid reason.
But isn't that one of the complaints that you have at the moment, that you think the science, that education and the scientific educational system is failing now?
I think it's failing. I think Chicago undergraduate is still very good. You know, probably get a better education there than Harvard. One thing you don't get is rich classmates. You know, Harvard, you know, I was so depressed when a girl I'd been in high school with, and her granddaughter was at the University of Chicago Medical School, and she'd been an undergraduate at Yale. I asked, what was more important at Yale, your classmates or your teachers? She said, of course, my classmates. As if the teachers at Yale were sort of irrelevant to the whole experience. Whereas at Chicago, I remember great teachers. You know, they really made you think something was important.
It says here also at the beginning of the first chapter, one of the things is to find a young hero to emulate.
Yes.
Who was your hero that you emulated?
Well, I certainly admired Orson Welles, in part because his grandmother was Watson, and my great-uncle was his guardian. But, you know, he was someone who achieved something when he was very young. And, you know, he was putting on plays when he was 12. He was directing.
Right.
And now my hero is Roger Federer. So I'm trying to emulate him, you know, I mean, just well, be like Federer.
But you have been a lifelong tennis player. There's a picture of you in here with a tennis playing coach. You told me that you hit a serve at 110 miles an hour last week.
Yeah, it was good. So, you know, I'm still trying to be young. Not, you know, I'm not trying to be a young scientist, but, you know, you have to feel you're young or you might as well not exist.
Were there any scientists that you were sort of had as heroes or admired when you were?
Well, certainly Linus Pauling. I became aware of him as a graduate student. He came to Indiana. He stood up on the lectern. You know, he really was flamboyant, and you know, he was going to unite biology and chemistry, and that was my goal. Because if you could unite biology and chemistry, then there was no need for God, which, you know, was, you know, the way I was raised.
There's one of your other advice things in here is don't be the brightest person in the room.
No, that was easy.
But what do you mean by this? Because I know that when you say
well, because you can't learn anything. Francis and I were trying to solve a chemical problem, the three-dimensional structure of DNA. Neither of us do any chemistry. Luckily, there was a chemist in the room. We weren't the brightest person in the room for the problem we were trying to solve.
Okay. So but your point about Linus, the reason I raised that at that point was because you said that this was almost written for Linus because he always was the brightest person in the room.
Yeah, I think he felt that way. I think his colleagues sometimes disagreed. But he didn't have much use for his colleagues. He was a rather lonely man at Caltech.
Now, you could have, when you applied for Caltech and Harvard and Indiana
yes.
to go for, right?
Yes.
And Caltech said no.
Yes.
Harvard said yes, but we won't give you a scholarship, and Indiana said, come along, we'll have a scholarship.
Yes,
right?
as long as I don't want to be an ornithologist.
Because at this point you were a lifelong
Yeah,
bird.
that's all they could see from my recommendations. I was, you know, obsessive bird watcher.
And this would be the...
And there was no point of that, you know, Indiana, you know, they had a course on birds, but, you know, that was it.
You're still a bird watcher? I mean, this is difficult for me because in English...
I don't live by birds. But I you know, take the binoculars because, you know, I'd like to think I could still, you know, spot a rare bird sometime. So I walk about with binoculars.
Here's one that might be of some interest to the people in the room. It says, choose a young thesis advisor.
Yeah.
The older you choose, the scientist you choose to do your PhD thesis with, the more likely you will find yourself working in a field that saw its better days a long time ago, possibly before you were born.
So, never, work for the chairman of the department or something like that. Lurie was 35. I was his first PhD student, so I got a lot of attention. So I think if you work for someone young, you get more attention. And the second you're going to be among the first PhDs in a field instead of, several hundred before you, which means that all good schools already have someone studying DNA replication.
Yeah.
So, they're not searching they're searching for someone who does genomics, epigenetics, histone deacetylases, buzzwords. Certainly RNAi, that's the one now.
But let's just stay with Indiana for a moment. In a sense, you were very lucky because there wasn't any... if you'd gone to Caltech or Harvard, you wouldn't have been able to follow the path you did in terms...
No, I could have at Caltech, but I'd been with Max Delbruck, who would have been a very difficult PhD supervisor instead of Luria.
All right, so when you went to Indiana, there was already a Nobel laureate there, Hermann Muller, who was working...
yes, he was still doing classical Drosophila
work. There was Tracy Sonneborn, who was working on...
paramecium, sort of cytoplasmic inheritance.
And then there was Salvador Luria.
Yes.
And if I'm correct, this would be 1947. So you were the first PhD student of Salvador Luria.
Yes.
And in the department as a postdoc was Renato Del Becco.
Postdoc, you could say research
senior.
associate, something. Yes, by his age, he was not a postdoc age; he was older. He was, at that time.
Renato was 33.
Luria was 2 years older than.
I mention this because this is it's my sense that a lot of people don't have much sense of a history of science. And although they can rattle off the names of scores and batting averages of baseball players, I still think it's really important and amazing, for me personally, and I hope this translates, that when you sit down and see that somebody just arrived at a place and there's Luria there and Del Becco's in the room and so on and so forth, these are astonishing names in the history of the science.
Well, Muller was certainly the most important American biologist the first half of the century. You could have almost said he was the most important biologist in the world. I mean, he was very farsighted, and his course was extraordinarily interesting to hear.
But you elected not to work with him, though?
Yes, because you could work with microorganisms 100 times faster. So, there was just the speed. And one could sort of see the results that were coming out of Muller's labs, which, that weren't worth learning.
The reason I mention that is that you made a choice, whereas there's a sort of a myth growing up around you of kind of lucky Jim, just sort of stumbling from one place to the next and just finding yourself in the right place, in the right location. I'm looking here at one of the reviews of the Double Helix, which was written by Jacob Bronowski, who, as you recall, was the deputy director of the Salk Institute here. And the review is titled Honest Jim and the Tinker Toy Model, referring to the model that you built of DNA with Francis. And it says, no one could miss the excitement in this story of a great and beautiful discovery, but James Watson has given it something more and unexpected, a quality of innocence and absurdity that children have when they tell a fairy story. Do you remember this?
Yes.
The style is shy and sly, bumbling and irreverent, artless and good-humored and mischievous. Does that sound like you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wish I could have written as good a sentence, so I couldn't have written it better.
But my point was that there's a shrewdness here in that you didn't bumble and stumble between Muller and Sonneborn and Salvador Luria. You picked Salvador Luria, you picked learning about phage,
I think that was, just the rigor of my University of Chicago education. There wasn't any doubt. I was never going to work for Muller. I never really thought about working for Sonneborn. And part of the Luria attraction was that he had worked with Max Delbruck, who was the hero of Schrodinger's What is Life? And
let's talk about What is Life, because this was a seminal book for many people I've spoken to. I mean, could you explain for the audience what here we have a physicist, Schrödinger, who writes a book about essentially the beginning of genetics.
Yeah, or the beginning of the search for the gene.
Search of the gene.
And he gave 3 lectures in Dublin in 1943 during the war. And Cambridge University Press put them into a book which came out a year later, and it came out in the United States in 1946, and I read it. And Francis Crick and Morris Wilkins both read it in 46. So we all read it roughly at the same time. And it posed the problem that how did you copy a gene? And what were the physical forces? And was it going to, were new laws of physics or chemistry going to have to be involved? I think it was, in those days, physics was the #1 science. There was overwhelmingly, it was a great age of physics. And that a great physicist was interested in biology was, like a hero. If you, saying biology is important.
I also got the sense, though, from talking to Francis and from reading things that Bruno had written and so on, that there was post-World War II, post-nuclear weapons
Yes.
and so on, that a lot of physicists said, enough of that, thank you, let's go and do some biology. Was that?
That was certainly part of it. Certainly it was the case of Leo Szilard. And he was very important in my life, I think, as he was just so intelligent. And of course he came here, Jonas had chosen him, and then he died all too soon. And but Leo generally tried to think 3 or 4 steps. If this is true, what might be true? Whereas most people only go 1 step at a time. Even very intelligent people generally don't make 2 steps. They wait for the second step to occur, then they'll think. Whereas Leo just was, the moment he had the idea of a chain reaction, 2 neutrons out, 1 in, that meant bombs. Then, he immediately saw the need to patent it because he could make a lot of money. And second, that, of course, you didn't want the Germans to know it, so he gave the patent to the British Admiralty. So, I mean, he was, and he thought, he'd think differently than other people. It was...
He persuaded Einstein to write the letter.
Letter, yes.
To the president.
Yeah, so without Leo, the bomb project in America would have not started properly. I mean, Fermi wasn't trying to do it. And I don't know the reasons why Fermi and Szilard and the other didn't really get along with each other. But Leo, I was with him the day Kennedy was killed. And, he was immediately thinking how he could influence Johnson. That's all that mattered. No sentiment for Kennedy, just we got Johnson. And so I remember, his first desire was to get supper and then to think about Johnson. So I went to have supper with him. It was a very creepy evening. But Leo kept me slightly from being destroyed by making me think about Johnson instead of about Kennedy. I mean, he was, extraordinarily, he could be very annoying, but he was just so acutely intelligent.
Our scientists, you end up biologists, are geneticists now, people who work in your field now in the same situation as the physicists were who were trying to leave. In other words, there's this, the loose language would be, having discovered the secret of life, we can now amend things and so on. We can do enhanced.
I don't know any biologist who's anywhere as clever as Leo.
But
I mean, he was, superior.
But are we in the same? Or do we have the same problem now? The same Faustian
Yes, I
bargain
mean, yes.
issue?
Now you could say we've done this onto the brain, but so far, there hasn't been a Delbruck and there hasn't been a Szilard. And maybe because the problem really isn't ready for being solved. In the sense, the phage world would have run into real difficulties if we hadn't come up with the DNA structure.
All right. So you go to how did you get to Cambridge? What's the quick project?
Well, Luria got me there because I wrote to him I wanted to do crystallography, and must have indicated that Wilkins didn't want me in London, and he met Kendrew, and Kendrew was looking for a postdoc to help him with microbes.
So there you met Francis.
Yes.
Worked with Francis. Next year will be your 80, 60, 40 tour. I've suggested you should get a tour bus and go on the road with this. It'll be your 80th birthday. Yes. Liz's 60th birthday, yes. Your wife.
And
40th anniversary of your wedding. 40th anniversary of your becoming director of Cold Spring Harbor, and the 40th anniversary of the publication of the Double Helix.
Yes.
Right?
So 68 was a big year for me.
68 was a big year. And you were married, in fact, here in La Jolla. I'm just wondering if we have... Well, that was the DNA paper, but let me just go forward a little bit here and just show a couple of people that... So that was you and Francis in Cambridge with the model. And these seem to be very posed pictures.
They were.
And
it was by accident that Time magazine was thinking of running a story, and so they found a photographer working for the student newspaper who photographed Francis and I. At that time, neither of us owned a camera, and I don't think, it wasn't in the English way of life to photograph us.
Well, you said in one of the things you have in here, slight digression, you say in here, avoid being photographed.
Yes.
I mean, you must have been photographed more than... I mean, you've not done a very good job of avoiding being photographed.
No, you got to know... No, I really meant when you become president of an institution. You want to have people below you in the photographs. You don't want a house organ with, the president over and over. And the only way, that you want to see the president is if he's with a true celebrity. So if you have a movie star visit the Salk, then you take a picture. Okay. And then the president will be thought important because he's with someone important. So
Okay, well, since you're now more of a rock star than things, it's okay that we had that photograph.
No, but no, you can. People's mother really like to see their children's photograph. It makes them important, whereas my parents are dead. So, I mean, there's no, you should, just spread the photographs around. That's really all I meant.
All right. Now, was it the photographer's suggestion? How did it come to pass that Francis was always elevated here and you're always looking up? And
well, Francis was, he was the king and I was, the prince. I was the younger son. I mean, Francis, he treated me like a, younger brother. And so, I had just enormous respect for Francis. Sometimes he pissed me off, but that didn't mean that he gave so many, he would go to the Double Helix and give these talks, and we all fled when we saw someone coming. And one day he took me aside, Jim. He said, "You don't know how important what we've done is." Francis could be so stupid, that I wouldn't think it was important, but
Yeah. There was, so that was the Nobel, the ceremonies there,
Yeah.
with Maurice Wilkins on the left, and that's Max Perutz and Francis, and John Steinbeck
Yes.
in the middle, the novelist. And
yeah, John Steinbeck was an enormous influence in my life because of The Grapes of Wrath, the book.
Right.
It was really it was what America was like in the 30s, what the Depression did to people, and the need that someone had to look after the people who were falling on hard times. That's why why I hated Republicans. They didn't seem to feel that you had to help people, Social Security, anything like that, that was just evil. Poor people were to die because they were inferior. That really was what they meant.
Well, so moving on a little bit.
Oh, that's with Jonas.
This is you with Jonas Salk.
Here at the Institute.
And
it's the same tie, I think, as I only probably had one tie. So it's probably in...
This is 1968. It was at a tea.
Oh, so it was probably when I was out here for the American Cancer Science Writers about 4 days before I got married.
Could be.
Yeah, that's it.
But I would look at this photograph a lot, and I try and put little thought bubbles on it. And because what on earth has Jonas just said, or it looks like he's just delivered an opinion about your psychiatric well-being or something.
Well, I was about to get married, and absolutely no one knew it. About 4 days later.
Oh, that's right, because it was a secret, wasn't it?
Yes, except Bruno's secretary, I guess, yeah, Sylvia.
So you actually got, you mentioned Bruno, that is Bronowski there on the right. You actually got married at a church, the reception was at Bronowski's house, right?
Yes. No, the reception was at the Valencia. There was, they were having dinner with friends. So the photographer was there. So Liz and I went to his house maybe at 7:30 and photographs were taken. Then we went to the church and the wedding was at 9.
You can certainly see this is the 60s. That thing there.
I don't know who that.
But the cigar, I don't think would be allowed here anymore. And there's another picture of same event. This is Renato Del Becco, Jonas Salk, Bruno, and Linus.
Yes.
Linus Pauling, which is a rather remarkable photograph.
I can't. Was that the same event? I don't think.
That's a different event.
That's what I thought.
That was Bronowski's 60th birthday party.
Yes.
And there's another nice bit of 60s fashion
There's
for
Leslie.
you.
Yeah.
And that's Leslie Orgel over on the right there.
Yes. And that's Marshall Nierenberg, I think. Looks like Marshall.
Right. And Paul Berg is somewhere hanging around. So there is in... let me just remind you of this. This is a little passage from Sidney Brenner's conversation with Lewis Walpert. Sidney had met, was at Oxford. He'd come in from South Africa, and was working at Oxford with Leslie Orgel.
No, he was working with Hinshelwood.
Well, yes, but he met
Leslie then.
He met Leslie Orgel, who was here at the Sol, and Sidney Brenner, who's also here at the moment, and Jack Dunitz.
Yes.
And Jack told them about the developments in Cambridge, and according to this story, the three of them, that's Jack and Leslie and Sydney, piled into a little old English car on a spring morning and
April,
drove from
probably
Oxford
April.
to Cambridge.
Yes.
It was April. In a car without a heater, which in England, as you know, is torture that time of year, to go in and look at the model. And Sydney says, I went into this room that was lined with brick, and there on the side, I can remember very clearly, was this small model with plates for the bases, the original model with everything screwed together, and I could see the double helix. Francis was sitting there. This was the first time I met him, and of course he couldn't stop talking. He just went on and on and on. It was very inspiring. Jim was at his desk in that room, which I came to occupy later when I came to the Cavendish, and he was interspersing comments with Francis. So that's when I saw the DNA model for the first time in the Cavendish, and in a flash you just knew that this was very fundamental. The curtain had been lifted and everything was now clear, and I got tremendously excited by this. I mean, do you have your own sense of February the 28th? You said
Yes, I think
Saturday. You came to the
I think it was
Cavendish.
before the model with 10 base pairs was
Yeah.
built, so they saw the smaller one. So
You came in on a Saturday morning to start fiddling with
yes,
curtains.
and then I put together AT and saw that GC was the same, and Francis was within a half hour, and saw the symmetry meant that you could flip-flop them over, so on any chain, all 4 bases. And he saw the symmetry demanded the chains run in opposite directions, and that explained the space group of DNA. So the space group was never used to generate the structure. The structure yielded what the space group was, and that's why it was. And with that, we knew how, or we thought we knew how DNA was copied.
I mean, this is almost impossible to do, but do you still have some inner sense of what it was like to?
No. I mean, it was 55 years ago.
Yeah, I know, but
I know that, the discovery occurred on a Saturday, and nothing happened in Cambridge on Sunday. It was very, very boring. And
the shops would shut.
yes, I mean, it wasn't until the Indians from Uganda came that anything was open on Sunday in England.
Right.
And so Sunday was very boring, and I went out and that evening went to an Argentine couple's house whose son tells me his father remembered my going out there and telling them we made this great discovery. That would have been the day afterwards.
Right.
So I generally didn't know what to do on Sunday evenings in Cambridge. Yeah, I mean, there were a couple, I never would eat in college, and it wasn't a good evening at Camille Pryor's boarding house to eat. So,
see, what I'm thinking of is that
I probably took my sister out there because she was still in Cambridge for another
Right.
2 weeks. So we'd
had
gone
to
to
type- she
the
had to
we'd
type up
gone
the
to
paper.
the Renaldini's. Yes,
She had to type up the paper.
yes, and so instantly we knew it was very big, and that created the problem of how to tell Morris Wilkins.
So there were actually quite a number of problems, weren't there? I mean, if they issue a new version of the book in 2008,
Yes.
which they probably will, is there anything that you would have changed about it?
I did, because I don't know why I had forgotten that, but it's in Wilkins' autobiography published a couple years ago, just before he died, that we asked him to put his name on the paper. And he said no, and he regretted it ever since. So it would have been, Watson, Crick, Wilkins paper, or something like that. Or
Yeah.
I don't know the order of the names. Francis remembers we flipped a coin, and boy, thank God I won.
I remember at Francis's memorial service that was held here a few years ago that Seymour Benzer gave one of the talks, and he began by saying, I knew Francis before his name was Watson Crick.
Well, that was the story that, I was at Caltech from 53, 55, and then Bragg had resigned his professorship to become director of the RI in London. And they appointed a successor who was Neville Mott, a solid-state theoretical physicist who was then at Bristol. And he came, and then when I came back in '56, Francis said, "You've got to meet Mott." And so Francis went to Mott and said, "I want you to meet Watson." And then Mott said to him, "I thought your name was Watson Crick." So, once you met Francis, you would just automatically think he did the whole thing. And and he could have if he, was concentrating on DNA, but he only concentrated on DNA after we got the structure. Before then he was doing his PhD thesis, yielding no results. Right. And, Bragg was hoping that he would, he would have given Francis a PhD without any data just to get rid of him. Yeah, because, Francis couldn't really say something that he didn't believe. And when he told, proofs that what they were doing was basically never going to work. And that's when Bragg said, Crick's a boat rocker. Yeah. And, boat rockers really tend to go nowhere.
Well, but don't you have the same sort of part of your personality? I mean,
yes.
Isn't it hard
and if it wasn't for the DNA, I wouldn't be here. I mean, that society doesn't like you to, it took a long while for, the people who said Iraq was a disaster. Actually, people didn't want to hear it.
Well, there's a line, there's a spectrum between being candid and being rude, right? And
I've never worried about that too much. No, because I mean, if you worry about it too much, you really can't be candid. And I think, there's such a sigh of relief when someone actually says what's true. It occasionally happens at a faculty meeting, but seldom.
Well, but you have some advice at the end here about making sure that your ideas to get to the most important person. I think something like that, yeah. Right? So that suggests that you still have some sense of the usefulness of politics within the science.
No, your desire is always to win. If you don't think that any other objective, but sometimes, in going to win, you have to be rude. That is, you can't win without occasionally making enemies. Some people try and just never make an enemy. And it doesn't work. I mean, because there are people, they're not necessarily evil, but, if their opinions prevail, your department or your institution just goes nowhere. So, in a sense, you just have to disregard them. And one of my rules is, never ask for advice unless you're going to take it. So, which is quite important, not to, ask what you should do to someone that you don't respect. So you're never polite, you go and ask them what you want. Hey, they're going to say something that you disagree, so don't talk to them.
So, what would you say? I mean, what are the biggest mistakes you've made in your life, and what did you learn from them?
One was, if you have an idea, publish it immediately. The messenger RNA, Sidney is still given credit for something we found months before he did. But, so, I read it all and over. Sidney discovered messenger RNA, and I think, fuck them. But, that's what I think, but, they'll when they make the program, they'll blurb that word out, so I don't have to, it won't go on the air, but that's what I think. And, but it was all my fault. off, or, not. And our problem was we had the result with phage, and we wanted to show that messenger RNA existed in E. coli. Because when I went and told Leo that, which was before even Sidney and Jacob and Francis met in Sidney's rooms in King's, Leo said, well, what about uninfected cells? So I thought, well, we have to get the uninfected cells. But it turned out there was so much, the ribosome RNA and amount just dominated the message. And we weren't doing hybridization. It was really hybridization which would have shown it. So that was a mistake. I didn't take the hybridization work in Paul Doty's lab seriously enough, as a methodology. Spiegelman did. So he really did that fast.
Any other mistakes or advice that you sought that you wish you never got?
The worst thing I've done is play tennis with friends. Because, you either beat them or you beat you, and no one learns anything. Right. So, it just, yeah.
It also says here, avoid gatherings of more than 2 Nobel Prize winners. All too often, some well-intentioned person gathers together Nobel laureates to enhance an event promoting his or her university or city. The host does so convinced that these special guests will exude genius and incandescent or at least brilliantly eccentric personalities. The fact is that many years pass between the awarding of a prize and the work it acknowledges, so even recently awarded Nobelists have likely seen better days. The honorarium, no matter how hefty, will not compensate you for the realization that you probably look and act as old and tired as the other laureates. The best way to remain lively is to restrict your professional contact to young, not yet famous colleagues. Though they will likely beat you at tennis, they will also keep your brain moving.
Yeah, it's true.
You believe that?
I mean, the people, I have close contact. Sidney is the only Nobel Prize winner that's, I find still fun to be with.
But still,
because he's trying desperately to, say something clever. Often it's not clever, but he's at least trying. And the others have, just.
Well, actually, it says here, this is Sidney. My initial impression of Jim Watson was of this rather eccentric, bright person who didn't pay as much attention to me as I would have liked. And who walked very rapidly with long strides, because we went for a walk. And he was someone who knew all the important people. You have to realize
that's
first meeting with someone who actually knew Delbruck and Luria and so on and so forth. So there's another Sydney story which I need to check with you, which is that it's a story about heading off. You drove.
Well, we drove across the country together.
Right. So
it must have been pretty scary for Sidney, but he never, because he didn't have a driver's license.
Well, it says here, we started at Cold Spring Harbor, and I have to tell you that Jim had just learned to drive, and he had a Chevy convertible. I'd spoken to people that he'd driven across the States from the West Coast who had quite a hair-raising trip with him, but he seemed all right. We spent a night at Yale with Jim's uncle, who was a professor of physics there, then headed to Boston when there was no radio in the car, and unknown to us, the famous Hurricane Caroline struck the East Coast. So apparently you kept on saying, yeah, this is perfectly normal weather. And Sydney is noticing that the entire town is deserted. That there's a church with a steeple upside down, sticking in the ground. And I asked Jim, isn't this a bad storm? And he replied, no, we get them this way here. So then you end up driving through the Kansas-Colorado border. There is a point to this story, by the way. The Kansas-Colorado border, the policeman stopped us and said, you went through a traffic light, get out of the car. And actually, Sidney was driving at this point. And he says, what do I do? And Sidney said, I could have, I don't think I did, but if I did, I'm terribly sorry about going through the light. And this was a Friday, I remember, and Jim kept saying to me through the side of his mouth, don't argue with him because he'll put us in jail and there'll be no judge till Monday. Till Monday, we'll have to spend the weekend in jail. He asked to see my driver's license and established that Jim owned the car. Then he went to look at the registration. He asked Jim, are you Mr. Dewey? Because Jim's middle name is Dewey, James Dewey Watson. He was named by his father after the philosopher Dewey at Chicago. Now, that's not right, is it?
No.
Didn't the Deweys come over on the...
No, the Deweys came in 1630, and I was we could show the connection between Governor Dewey and my Deweys. But not to the librarian of Columbia College, but I think to Admiral Dewey. So, it was just,
I also mention this because, I mean, from these stories, and there's a lot written about you and so on, it seems like there's a lot of great camaraderie as well, apart from the...
Oh, Sydney was fun. It still is fun.
Yeah.
I mean,
Cold Spring Harbor. It's written that this will be your memorial, that you did an extraordinary job. What led you to go there, and why did you decide to turn it into
it was so important for me that, there's days with the Phage Group, summer of 48, summer of 1950, and the symposium afterwards. I just didn't want it to die. So, and I didn't see any other way except becoming the director myself. And then the other was, I wanted to do experiments with tumor viruses like Renato was doing here. And at Harvard, I could have never, started a group there. And so it was an opportunity to give me a new life. To get out of E. coli and move into animal cells. So, and then, luckily, John Cairns introduced me to Joe Sambrook, who was working with Renato, and Joe came, and he was extraordinarily good at, attracting people, and so we were. Cold Spring Harbor was probably more exciting than any other place in the 70s. Stanford would say they were, and, I'm not going to argue, but we were less pompous. It was, it was just a community of young people with no Arthur Kornberg to sort of put a downer on you.
So let's just switch to your personal genome. In May, I guess your personal genome was deciphered, to be followed somewhat more recently
Yes.
by Craig Venters. You guys seem to still be in competition. What was the reason for doing this? Why did you...
No, I was asked by the Jonathan Rosberg, who founded the new sequencing company 454, could they have some DNA. They wanted me as a test case that the 454 could sequence someone. And I said yes, and I said they could put it all up on the web, but I myself did not want to know my apolipoprotein, the Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
So I didn't want anyone to know that, otherwise they could put it up. And because I think our science will move faster if a lot of known people just put up their genomes so people can try and correlate phenotype with genotype. But I think, the only people who could probably safely do this are people who've already very successful and won't worry about losing their insurance or their job or, so probably sequence a lot of successful people whose career is sort of, almost over.
So why were you worried about, why didn't you want to know about the Alzheimer's possibility?
I thought there was one chance in 4 I'd have it, and, I think about it every day from then on. Because I'm slowing down, and, you just like to think it's not Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is very grim. So, I don't worry about it now at all. So,
but you've already got planned how, I mean, when the final bugle sounds, which you said you think will be in your 80s, you've already planned where you want to have this service and everything, right?
No, I would, I thought the one for Francis here was, it was good, but, I'd rather not have, there was no good music, and there, it is a wonderful setting, but it's not really as beautiful as a church.
A church?
Yeah, I mean, you should, I'm a Christian, even though culturally, though I don't believe in God, and, so, it seemed to me it gave me most of my values, and, great church music, or the King James Bible, great words. And no Christoph Koch or anything like that. I mean, no nutcakes. And so,
But it doesn't seem slightly inconsistent here, all the other things you've written about religion, that you want to go to a church.
No, I'm just saying that I think, a Jew cannot believe in God and still go out in a synagogue, which, why not? And, but a Christian is supposed to, go out in a YMCA or something like that. And, an atheist. And so, I'm just saying, the occasion might be more ennobling if it had good music. Because, you might as well.
Well,
I think we have, I think atheists get a sort of bum rap that, we're just heartless and we, don't care for people, or we totally reject the values we've been brought up on. And, to me, it's just, I have, most of the ideas of Christianity, sound good, but in reality, some of them aren't very good, but, they sound good, and so it makes a good funeral.
So if you had not had the option of, if you hadn't become a scientist, is there anything else that you could consider having done as a career, as a...
Well, as according to what it is, I would have become a naturalist.
Okay, well, let's exclude ornithology, because that's a bit too close. I mean, is there anything else, professional tennis player?
I could become a professional Democrat. Yeah, that's probably the way I'd have gone. Because, yeah.
So, who's the smartest person you've ever met, and who's the wisest?
Smartest, the people I know, it was Szilard.
Leo Szilard.
Yes. If you go toward wisdom, that's a different, someone like Bruno. He really was,
So
he was good.
What's the difference between smart and wise in your view?
I guess wisdom is, I connected with how humans should behave. Whereas Leo was, not very interested in people per se. Whereas Bruno was really interested in people.
Mm-hmm. So this is the same, when you're talking about you think yourself a Christian, you're basically talking about some sort of a moral code, right?
Yes, a moral code.
Now where do you think morals come from?
Now the buzzword is from our DNA. That we only could have survived, as a species if we cooperated with each other. And that's true of a lot of other species. There's a lot of cooperation built into it. So, and to have cooperation, you've got to sort of like the human face, the human voice. So, and why we, how you can do that, that's far too complicated for me to say, but I do think it must be it's got to be in our genetic message that we work well, that we have to work with other people.
So how do you answer the people who think that that putting too much emphasis on nature is scientific reductionism, materialism?
Well, because you really can work out nature, whereas nurture is very hard to define. Or actually, is it prenatal? We can give you the genetic component, a growth factor which makes, neurogenesis and leads to a higher IQ. Those we'll find. The nurture we like because we think we can control it. So if the more important nurture is, in theory, you should be able, to influence what our children are like. But, the people who have done this haven't had children. To the extent of, knowing how hard it is to, often, I can think with my son Duncan, boy, he's becoming more like me, but I would have never thought that at 20. So the genes are taking over, I think, as he gets older, because it's certainly not my direct influence. Now he lives in San Francisco, but, I can see so we can study the genes. The nurture is so hard to study, and it's, I'm a product of nature and nurture. I think there's all these accidental events. I had a very, very good nurture. Mm-hmm. At every stage, someone was helping me. I never felt alone. Even today, I don't feel alone. And but I think probably, the things that really made Francis and I unique were our genes. You never met Francis's mother, but you just can't imagine Francis being her son. He was just like Henry Higgins. He was a character out of Shaw. Yeah, he was just, and so everything you read about his background would never have made Francis Francis. So what else could it be? So, and I guess why I like genes is we can actually study them. The other is so hard.
Who would you have liked to have had a one-on-one conversation with? Historical, anybody, living, dead?
Oh, in retrospect now, Charles Darwin.
Darwin.
It would be great to, bring Darwin back alive and tell him what had happened now. He'd be very happy.
Well, see, but this is what I was talking about. When I went to Down House,
yes.
and what I was doing a TV piece, and I actually used Darwin's cane and walked along the sandwalk.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, when he came up with those ideas and so on, did he not have some sense of sort of glee or something at having actually figured this out? And did you have the same sort of sense at all? I mean, this cover photograph on avoid boring people. We'll get to that in a minute, but go ahead. Just
yeah, certainly. Yeah, sure, but not too much. It was so. The moment you had DNA, I started thinking about RNA. Yeah, so the glee was rather short. Yeah. I would say that period of, total happiness was 5 months.
5 months.
And then I arrived in California in the smog in Pasadena, and, I was in literal hell. So, it was gone. But, it was very, it was wonderful. So I'll never get over Cambridge.
Darwin would be your pick for a historical visit.
Yeah, and I think there's no one who ever, probably who will ever live who will be as important as Darwin. I mean, he really,
So Here's one last question.
And not a trace of German blood. You know, he was an Englishman.
Well, but now you know perfectly well if you go far enough back.
Yes, we're all related.
Yes.
I know that, but, you know, we only go back a couple hundred years. You know, you just like to think that your relatives have done well.
All right, so what are you optimistic about?
Well, I think we can stop cancer. Yeah. Virtually no one in this room believes it because they're looking forward to a life of studying it. And you know, I think Judah Folkman, who, you know, his ideas are half accepted. Angiogenesis is now, everyone knows, is important. But there's both promoters of angiogenesis and inhibitors of it. And there was one try to, you know, give the inhibitors to people to see if it could cure their cancers. And it was generally perceived to fail. It actually worked in a couple of neuroendocrine tumors, but so small you could always argue, well, they got well and it wasn't that. So I think we should give it a try. Probably the most important ignored fact in the world now is there is one group of people in the world who don't get cancer. They don't get solid tumors. And those are people who grow up with an extra copy of chromosome 21, Down syndrome. They get testicular cancer and they get leukemias, and they don't get solid cancers. Overwhelmingly statistically significant. I heard about it 30 years ago, but it was not enough lived long enough, so the statistics were convincing. So the way to cure cancer is ask why we don't get cancer, not ask why we do get it.
Okay.
So I think it could be done, and it would cost somewhat less than $1 billion. So I'm, you know, moving from one billionaire to another, and you know, all I need is 25 million, and then the billionaire has about, I think, a 25% chance of, you know, being worth twice what he's worth. And but I think, you know, right now part of the reason is you can't really name anyone who's really equal to Jonas Salk in improving the human condition. We need another one. So I hope it's Judah. So, I mean, and I think he just has no desire to, he's not a businessman. So, you know, I think it can be done, but oh boy, the leaders of our cancer community, oh boy, do they hate that idea. Because, you know, they just want everything to be P53 or something like that. Actually, you know, P53 blocks angiogenesis. You get rid of P53 is probably one reason it's so bad for you. You let it go on. But P53 people, you know, and the people in Cold Spring Harbor are as bad as they are here. You know, I mean, in the sense that they don't really, you know, it is, you know, it's a real lesson for young people. The old people really fuck up things. And the young people have to save us from old fuck-ups. Yeah, so I mean it.
So that's what you're optimistic about.
Yeah, I want to change the world in my 80s. So I want to be more important in my 80s than I've been before. So, you know, but I need a billionaire. It gives me 25 million, then I'll put together the cast, and we can do it.
Well, with that pitch for funding.
In the presence of a benevolent billionaire,
and with the proviso that we can have you back to see how well you've done on this next course
ask
of your
me
life.
at 90, we'll see. If I haven't, you know, vanished like most men do in their 80s.
All right. Jim Watson, thanks very much.
Okay.